Well, first, a very warm welcome to AUC, those of you who are visiting as guests today on this momentous occasion where we're celebrating the appointment of our new president. Also, welcome to those of you who are on Zoom. This event is being also posted on Zoom at the same time, and we'll have interaction both from the audience here as well as from those on Zoom. Those on Zoom, if they have questions, please feel free to send them on the chat, and we'll receive them to be able to take them as we go along during the program. It's a particular pleasure for me to be able to host and moderate this event, which is on refugees and forced migrants, essentially. I say this because AUC has, for many, many years, been really at the forefront of institutions in the Middle East dealing with political and social issues. We've always attempted to address the issues that are prominent and important to people, but also take into account multidisciplinary topics and experiences. And this one, frankly, involves everything from politics to security to economics to human and social issues. But I also think the choice of this event for this occasion is important. When you're appointing or having already appointed a new president, it's very important to convey the message that you want as an institution, and that reflects on the topics that we have for the panel here. And I want to take the occasion on behalf of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy to congratulate President Dalal. We are really very warm welcome to you here, and we wish you all the success. I'm going to do what I do every time I speak, boast a little. I am very proud to be able to say that the work at CMRS, the Center for Migration and Refugees, has really been exceptional over the years. It's been exceptional both in the depth of the issues dealt with, the amount of the work done, and the challenges they faced, whether it is revolutions, pandemics, or very limited resources that they had to deal with for different reasons. So this is a center that really has respected academic rigor, but at the same time made it a point to bring the experiences of practitioners to their audience, be that students, researchers, just laymen, when they hold public events. So I want to thank Ibrahim and his team for what they've been doing on this subject, and I think from the event today you will get a sense of how rich their work really is. We have three, next slide please. We have three panelists this evening. And I'm not going to go through their CVs because their CVs should be behind me by now. Well, Ibrahim Awad is the director of the Center for Refugees and Forced Migration. He's an internationally acknowledged expert in this area. He's worked both as a very distinguished academic, but also in the refugee and migration area, as well as at ILO. And I just mentioned 2 or 3 bullet points from his experience in this regard. Dr. Maisa Ayoub is the Associate Director of the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies. She has 2 graduate degrees on this subject in particular, and carries a really heavy load in trying to put together the center's activities, its research, and as well as supporting Ibrahim in the academic parts of it. Dr. Sarah Sadeh is, very proudly to say, a CMRS graduate. She's also an adjunct professor presently at the center and has a PhD focusing on this subject in particular. Just to kick off the topic today, because it's an important topic, let me just sort of throw out some ideas. Next slide, please. We are basically talking about 3 categories of people, all of whom had to move from where they are because of circumstances. Forced migrants, and these are those who were forced to migrate because of circumstances, be that discrimination, economic issues, whatever. Refugees, who reacted to, if you want, more intense, acute situations and had to cross borders from their country to other countries. And those internally displaced. Many, many years ago when this whole process started, people tended to ignore the internally displaced. But you'll notice from the figures you'll see in a second that these numbers are really substantial, and therefore it is much more appropriate that they be taken into account. Next slide, please. What you see here is basically, I chose the last 50 years for no particular reason, but I couldn't have chosen the 7,000 years of Egyptian history, so I decided to choose something we could relate to. This slide shows you where we started off back in 71, if I'm not mistaken, 71, all the way to 2021. Now, as a Middle Easterner, while I will show you and explain the graph for you, but I can't discuss the subject without first saying that even before those 50 years, there were the Palestinian refugees who left when they were forced to leave Palestine, and their numbers have, the first generation numbers have crossed 5 million people. So I just put that for the record, even though I don't have them on this graph per se. Now, if you look at this graph, the first massive wave back in the early 70s was the Bangladesh War. That's the first figure you see here. It increased with the Vietnam War and ultimately with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. These numbers sort of started to go up a bit. Again, in the 80s, the numbers increased because of the Iraq-Iran War and the civil wars in Central America. In the 90s, you reached a peak, mostly because of civil wars, because of ethnic cleansing, most prominently Rwanda, Tajikistan, Bosnia, Croatia, Myanmar, Georgia, Kosovo, Indonesia, and others. Besides the internal situation in Iraq, where the government persecution caused different ethnic groups to leave Iraq. The number of refugees, as you will see from the graph here, actually declined around 1993. But again, 7-8 years later, by 2000, it started to increase again with the US invasion of Iraq. As I said, one of the massive eruptions was in 1990, but by 2011, you had another series of refugees and displaced persons and so on, mostly because of our revolutions, whether it is Yemen, Libya, South Sudan, and of course the Syrian civil war. Huge movement of people for different circumstances. By 2020, the numbers we were talking about, whether it was new events or the ongoing ones, we were talking about 11 million people that were under these different categories and facing these problems. Syria is right up there on the top of the list in terms of the contemporary process. They have 6.8 million people who are considered to have been affected by this process. Venezuela, beyond the region, 4.9. Afghanistan and South Sudan, 2.8 and 2.2 million people. Now, these are the countries where people are leaving. Now, if they're leaving somewhere, they're obviously going somewhere. And in terms of the Middle East itself, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and Egypt have been the largest recipients of refugees and immigrants from the region, not from beyond the region. An interesting figure is that if you look at the UNHCR reports in 2019, the internally displaced persons were more than the refugees who fled their countries. And that's why we made the point that to give you the three categories. And they were estimated to be 11 million people. So you have a very significant number of people moving from their homes to other parts of their own countries, but then living in tents or shacks or so on. Even where civil wars have stopped or the violence has stopped, it doesn't mean that the refugees immediately go back to where they were. And actually, in most circumstances, they don't go back that easily. So the ramifications of these problems extend considerably and take into account a lot of different things. Excuse me. Now I know how to make it work. In essence, we have a problem here that's going to take time to deal with, and it's going to take time to resolve, be that globally or regionally. And to give you a more detailed perspective of the ramifications of the problem, with emphasis on the Middle East and our region, I'm going to ask the three panelists to talk about these issues. Now, I'll address a question or two to each one of them, but they're of course free to add other points that they may have. Let me start with Dr. Awad, not because he's the director, but because he's the first on my left. And, oh, by the way, notice we have a 50-50 gender balance here. So just didn't want to let that pass because we're always criticized when we miss that. Ibrahim, let me just pose 2 or 3 questions to you. Is there a distinction between a Middle Eastern refugee and displaced person and those in other parts of the world? Or is it basically the same issues and the same problem? Second question, again, from the regional perspective, have different regional countries who are the recipients of refugees dealt with the refugees in the same manner, or is there a distinction between the way one country or the other country deals with it? I won't ask you the third question, but I'm sure you're going to address it. So let me just keep that and let you first make your comments, and then if I feel you haven't, I'll come back to that. Go ahead.
A refugee is a refugee, whether a refugee is in the Middle East or a refugee is in Latin America or in Southeast Asia. There is a definition for who a refugee is under the 1951 Convention. Now, we happen to be in Africa, and Egypt is, in addition to being a party to the 1951 Convention, International Convention, is a party to an African Convention, an OAU Convention. And the OAU Convention is more generous when it comes to defining who a refugee is. So a refugee under the 1951 Convention is someone who has been persecuted in his or her country of origin or country of residence for one of 5 reasons, political, social. In Africa, a refugee can be a victim of a collapse of public order, of natural disasters. So here we have a more generous definition, which has repercussions for what we call durable solutions later, and I don't want to get into these complicated issues because the parties to the 1951 Convention are not bound by the OAU Convention, therefore may not accept the refugees recognized under the African Convention. So what a refugee, let's say, is a refugee. Now, what is different is how refugees are received, are hosted. Refugees leave their country to seek protection. You have, in the region, transboundary ties. You have shared identity, which makes hosting easier and more difficult at the same time. And therefore, you have witnessed in the case of the region, when it comes to Syrian refugees in particular, Iraqi refugees first and then Syrian refugees, you have countries and populations receiving quite well at the beginning the refugees from Syria. One of the explanations were that in 2006, Lebanese took refuge in Syria. So some Lebanese said that it is our turn now to sort of return the generosity. But with time, things start to change. Things start to change because there is some sort of fatigue in the region. And you find this in different countries in the region. What is also distinguishable in this region is that you have very high rates of migration. You mentioned that Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan Turkey, in fact, has the highest number of refugees from Syria. However, Lebanon has the highest rate because of the small population in Lebanon. And Jordan, by the way, follows. So you have commonalities, and this is why we can talk of a regional perspective. You have, these are developing countries, all of them, and they have the weight of meeting the needs of their populations. And you have a tension between meeting the needs of population and meeting the needs of the refugees that come seeking protection. What do you do? There is a challenge there. Of course, we need also to say that refugees also look after themselves. There is a widespread idea that refugees are an absolute burden on countries, hosting countries. In fact, refugees also work, and this is why countries would do well in allowing refugees to work, because in working, they would take care of themselves. But the feeling is shared in the region. And by the way, at CMRS, we're doing at present a comparative study on Syrian refugees in the Middle East and Venezuelan refugees in Latin America, how they were hosted, how their livelihoods were ensured, what the reactions of both three, because in the case of Venezuela, there is also some sort of shared identity between Venezuelans and Colombians and Ecuadorians. In our case, of course, it's obvious, and there's no need to explain it. So we're doing, and I think this will be an addition, because funnily enough, no one has done comparative study about these very close in time massive flows of refugees. So this is why I think a regional perspective is interesting, in particular because we now have some scholars who come up with the idea of refugees should be hosted and cared for by countries in the region, where, in fact, the responsibility is international. It's not only in the region. If there is a dysfunction in the Middle East, the Middle East is only a subsystem of the international system. What happens in this region has origins in the functioning of the whole international system. And we know that, take the case of Iraqi and Syrian refugees. These have originated in dysfunctions in the regional system. Who set up the regional state system? The regional state system is a product of the settlement after World War I. So we cannot escape the fact that this region is very closely linked to the international system, and we have seen a testimony to that when flows just left and went to Europe. Europe is in the neighborhood. Europe is a neighbor. So this is another subsystem with close linked to our system in the Middle East also. So I think that a regional analysis is quite useful, and it also goes to underline the responsibilities that are taken up by countries of the region, the need to share in the responsibility of hosting and providing livelihoods for refugees, and the responsibility of the international system in its entirety for refugees. Did I answer your questions?
Well, Ibrahim, if I may. On the issue of refugee rights, and if you want, refugee assistance, I understand refugee rights would be governed by the international treaties or regional treaties that exist. But in terms of providing assistance to refugees, is that a function of their capacity to generate a livelihood, or is it a function of how far they've left? I mean, how is it governed? Do you give assistance and give the same rights to any refugee, whether they need it or not?
Of course, you determine who an asylum seeker is entitled to the status of refugee or not. So there are steps to determine whether I deserve to be considered a refugee, and therefore to be provided protection and to be provided with rights and even access to the labor market, which is something that does not happen in all countries in this region. But there are rights to refugees under several instruments, the International Convention, but also under international human rights instruments. Sure. As for assistance, the preamble to the 1951 Convention talks about international cooperation in burden sharing. International cooperation in burden sharing. But it leaves it at that. In 2017, the General Assembly met, in fact, after the Syrian refugee flows. And they discussed what to do. And they came up in 2018 with the so-called Global Compact on Refugees, which is a soft law instrument, soft international law instrument that elaborates on the convention and that goes further. There is tangible progress in it. And it mentioned, again, international cooperation, but again, without putting any criteria to measure this cooperation. There is emphasis on cooperation, but there is no criteria. Now, the question, it's practical. Look at, after 2016, the European Union and countries like Germany raised considerably their assistance to countries in the region, especially to Jordan. And why? For practical reasons. Because, in fact, they wanted refugees to stay in the region. So international cooperation, in fact, serves the purposes of those who provide. But again, there is no scale. It is said in the Global Compact, according to the volume of the economy, and according to several criteria that come into play, but it doesn't go further than that.
Again, let me push you a little bit on this. From what you're saying, am I correct in concluding that refugee does not have to prove evidence of need to get assistance? Or does he have to prove?
No. In the case of Palestinian refugees, there is no definition. But UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East, came up with a sort of definition, practical definition, saying that Palestinian refugees are those inhabitants of Palestine between June 1946 and May 1948 who lost sources of livelihoods. Not all Palestinians. Only those who lost sources of livelihood are the Palestinian refugees and their descendants, of course. So, but in the 1951 Convention, you don't. Now, you give assistance, of course, when there is a need for the refugees to receive assistance. But imagine a refugee who is a medical doctor and who is allowed to practice medicine. She or he will not need to be assisted. So in fact, those who need to be assisted are those who cannot work or who do not have sources of livelihood. And this is where policy comes in.
Okay, I'm sure we'll come back to some more detailed questions. Let me move from Dr. Awad to Dr. Ayub. And I'd like you to take us a little bit more in depth into the region at a national level. How do you see different countries in the region? Who's carrying the heaviest burden in terms of refugees? And it's just one example, one question. Another question would frankly be, are there unique practices from one country to the other? And I'll give you an example, having done this from the governmental side. Egypt, for example, provides different benefits to different nationalities of refugees. As far as I'm aware, and I may be mistaken, that's a national decision that we take. It's not something that is governed by. But are there other cases where this happens? And frankly, is that a good way to deal with it or not? And thirdly, could you, again, also shed a little bit of light on what can be done in the regional states to provide more opportunities for refugees, since obviously we're going to continue to have this problem for quite a while. Maisa, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean. Before going into explaining the opportunities, the livelihood opportunities that are offered by the different countries of the region, I would just like to comment on the question you asked Dr. Ibrahim about the assistance. According to the 1951 Geneva Convention, there are some articles that deal specifically with the provision of education, for example, of healthcare, and according to the convention, states are obliged to provide assistance to refugees, recognized refugees and asylum seekers. However, also states have the right to put reservation on certain articles. With the exception of article on non-refoulement, is all other articles almost they can put reservation, and that's what Egypt did, for example, and other countries of the region. However, the assistance of UNHCR, as Dr. Ibrahim said, depend on because of funding, because UNHCR funding comes from states. So depending on the funding, they can't give assistance to all refugees. So those who are considered the most vulnerable groups are the ones who are, they take assistance. In terms of your first question, providing livelihood opportunities and services to refugees and asylum seekers in the region is very challenging for two reasons. One, which Dr. Ibrahim mentioned, is that most of the countries of the region are developing countries, so they are struggling to cater for the local population. There is always this tension. But the second challenge is that the absence of a comprehensive legal framework that govern protection. There is, of course, the 1951 convention, but countries like Jordan and Lebanon, they didn't sign the convention. They signed memorandum of understanding with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, but at the end, these memorandum of understanding, they don't have any legal weight. Egypt signed the 1951 convention, but until today, there are no local asylum legislation. However, Egypt, as of last year, announced that its intention to start drafting its first local asylum law. So this makes it difficult to provide for livelihood opportunities to refugees and asylum seekers. Having said that, the countries of the region exert a lot of effort to provide livelihood opportunities, but because of these two restrictions, the economic situation of the different countries and the non-existence of a legal framework in the case of Jordan and Lebanon, and now in the case of Lebanon, because of the economic crisis and the recent problem, because of these problem, the real problem is the actual attainment of these rights, the actual enjoyment of this right. So it's not a problem of access to right rather than actual, legal access to right, but actual access. So if you take, for example, education. Education is unrestricted in Jordan and Lebanon to all refugees. But in Lebanon, of course, we know there is a big problem. Even before the current economic crisis, in 2018, it was estimated that over 58% of Syrian refugee children are out of formal education. In Egypt, like you just mentioned, access to education, but only to education, is on the basis of nationality. So Syrians, Sudanese, and Yemenis have access to primary and secondary public schools. All other refugee groups don't because of the language barrier. However, again, the problem is that these three groups, even though they do have the right to access education, they don't actually access it in practice because of the overcrowding of schools and the problem with the schooling system in general. So the end result is that most of them, the big majority, resort to informal schooling, which doesn't offer any kind of official certificate. The same is with regard to health. But health in Egypt is not restricted. It's to all refugees and asylum seekers once those registered with UNHCR. But we have to know that there are a number of people who are not registered with UNHCR. Either their file are closed because they were rejected and they continue to stay in Egypt, or they didn't approach the UNHCR to start with. So only those who are registered with UNHCR have complete access or free access to primary and secondary healthcare facilities. But again, the problem is the actual access. Free vaccination is provided to every refugee and asylum seeker, including the new COVID-19 vaccination. With regard to employment, again, Jordan is a bit different. In Egypt and Lebanon, refugees and asylum seekers can access the labor market, but they must secure a work permit. In Lebanon, this has been always a problem, and that's why most of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon work in the informal sector. In Egypt, it's also a problem, and most of the refugees and asylum seekers in Egypt work in the informal sector because they cannot get a work permit, because getting a work permit is very challenging. You need to find an employer who is willing to sponsor you. But in Egypt, there are other, it's less problematic because some refugees and asylum seekers actually do find employers who are willing to sponsor them. For example, local NGOs, they do need refugees and they offer refugee jobs, but because of other bureaucratic challenges, like, for example, the fact that the Ministry of Manpower does not recognize the UNHCR card and request that a valid passport, request that the refugee and asylum seeker would have a valid passport in order to issue a work permit, this makes it impossible to get a work permit. So they end up working in, even if they work in formal organization, they work with like service agreement, consultancy agreement that doesn't offer employment rights. So to come to the second question, which is how can things be better? I think, as Dr. Brahim mentioned, international cooperation in sharing the responsibility of the refugee crisis is really essential. And in 2017, the center organized a conference under the name of International Cooperation. And the practitioners and academics in the center, who attended the conference, they came up with a number of recommendations to enhance international cooperation, and the recommendations are available on our website. A lot has been done since then, but not unfortunately, but a lot has been done, so more is needed. More is needed to help countries of the region, not only countries of the region, but also countries of the South in general, to be able to host refugees and asylum seekers. Another important point, which is related also to international cooperation, is that if we look at Jordan in 2016 signed the Jordan Compact, which eased the regulation to access the labor market and offered Syrian refugees a lot of opportunities, and the unemployment rate of Syrian in Jordan decreased. However, it did not create new jobs. So there is this issue of the need to create new jobs that can absorb the local and the refugees. So not only to ease the access to the labor market, which is essential, but also to create new jobs. And to do that, we need international cooperation in terms of financial assistance and technical assistance. And lastly, I think, as I said, that the problem is not the right, but the access to right. The center in the last few years did a research on refugee rights in Egypt, and the findings of this research suggest that there are a number of enabling laws and ministerial decrees that were passed in the last few years, but they're not implemented. And they're not implemented not only because the economic situation of Egypt, the overcrowding of schools and hospitals and all these issues, but also because there is lack of awareness among the implementers of the law, the like junior government officials, as well as lack of awareness on the part of the refugees and asylum seekers themselves. They're not aware of the new rights. And for that reason, the center is now engaged in a number of trainings and awareness raising that target government officials and local NGOs and the refugees and asylum seekers themselves. I think I answered.
Thank you. Yes, you did. A couple of quick follow-up questions. What's the country in the region that has the largest number of refugees?
In the region? As Dr. Ibrahim mentioned, we consider Turkey to be part of the region.
I'm looking at the UN definition of the Middle East.
Okay.
Arab, Israel, Iran.
It's, of course, Lebanon and then Jordan.
Okay. You said that UNHCR has a problem of financing for
of course, yeah.
Now, I know that UNRWA is focused on Palestinian refugees, but when donors contribute to UNHCR, can they earmark the money, or is it given to the UNHCR budget and UNHCR decides how to spend it?
Honestly,
Can they decide who to give it to, or is it given to the budget per se?
it's of course a question to UNHCR, but from the number of meetings that I attended with UNHCR, I think some of the budget are earmarked. I'm not 100% sure because...
I should know, but frankly, I don't remember if that was the case.
There are calls for mobilizing resources for Syrian refugees.
I know, but I mean, if somebody's contributing to UNHCR, can they determine where the money goes there? That's beside the particular efforts that are made for Syria, Palestine, Jordan, or so on. I'm just curious because, I mean, it does restrict. Anyway, we can find this out later. The other question I was going to ask you, the Lebanese and Jordanian decision not to sign the documents, so is that a function of politics, their concern about residency issues long term, or is it a function of economics because they don't want to, they cannot provide a large enough market for the refugees?
I'm not sure, but the thing is, I want to highlight that most countries of the region are not signatory to the 1951 convention. So it's only Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, right? Sudan, yeah. So Sudan, for example, of
It's
course,
probably emerged then between the two,
Yeah.
a little bit politics and a little bit the economics. Okay.
Egypt became party in 1981, 30 years after the convention was, even though Egypt was at the negotiating table in 1951.
Sure.
It was rejected, did not sign, nor ratify until 30 years.
And unless I'm mistaken, my understanding is the Palestinian refugees in Egypt have the same benefits as Sudanese and Syrians, and they don't?
Palestinians are a very different category because Palestinians do not fall under the mandate of the UNHCR. So it's UNRWA who is responsible.
Exactly. Sure.
However, Palestinians fleeing Syria are included under UNHCR.
So not the original refugees.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Let's move on to Dr. Sadeh for a couple of issues as well, and then we'll open it up to the floor or to the Zoom link. Dr. Sadeh, again, give us a little bit, some elaboration on the legal framework. What governs the countries in the region in terms of how they deal with this, whether it is their adherence to the convention or the lack of it? And how do you see, where should the current refugee framework, where should we push it? I mean, what needs to be added to that framework? Please, Dr. Sadeh.
Thank you so much, Dean. And I'll just elaborate quickly on some of the points mentioned by Dr. Ayoub and Dr. Awad. The fact that the 1951 Convention remains the cornerstone or the legal framework when it comes to refugees broadened by the 1969 OAU Convention. And as mentioned, the majority of countries in the region have not signed both conventions. However, they have replaced that in a way operationally, according to one of the clauses of the 1951 Convention, ensuring that collaboration between host countries and UNHCR is ensured through these memorandum of understandings. I think also what's very surprising is that most of the countries of the region have tended to sign Palermo protocols related to trafficking and smuggling rather than ones related to refugees and protection. And I'll get to the implications of that in a second. However, the legal framework remains that UNHCR is the key entity providing services through its earmarked funding and the one providing protection. And protection is defined in the ultimate sense as being protected against deportation and forced return. According to clause 33 of the 1951 Convention, that even the non-signatory countries are obliged to respect this clause. However, in recent years, we have seen incidences of deportations that has happened casually or on an ad hoc basis in some countries, and this principle was sort of challenged in a way. However, there are also other elements of protection when it comes to children and youth on the move, for example, or children who are moving or children who are refugees. And these are listed clearly in the conventions on the rights of the child, whereby they have the right to receive appropriate services from the UN agencies and international partners in collaboration with the states. They also have the right to seek reunification or seek tracing of their family members through the help of agencies. I would really like to shed the light quickly on another element of protection that UNHCR have introduced, particularly after the influx of Iraqis in the Middle East, and which was named as protection spaces. And by protection spaces, it was not necessarily a legal term, but rather that UNHCR introduced a document to sort of highlight the importance of having a socio-economic framework that would allow refugees, even residing on a temporary basis, to have a dignified life. Again, it's very important to look at the implications of that because first, there is a sort of mutual exclusivity when we talk about migrants versus refugees. And in recent years, in the 90s and particularly in the early 2000s, we've seen different forms of laws. UNHCR and other UN agencies call them mixed flows, secondary migration, mixed migration. I mean, they're all terms that try to define a new pattern of movement. And these these basically include people who have fled or have left their countries of origins for different reasons, but they both use the same dangerous routes, usually in an undocumented or irregular manner. And for that type of patterns, there have been more interest and response, if you will, because of the assumption that everybody is moving to Europe. Whereas in fact, mixed migration is also very prevalent in countries in this region, not only as transit. I mean, some of them end up staying in the region. So even if the aspiration is to move to Europe, they end up staying. And again, the challenge is that of having of not having a legal framework or a legal reference to mixed migration is a problem. Because then, what is the protection framework for people on the move, if you will? I mean, the term is very much contested, but the fact that refugees have a legal framework, but what about people in the middle of this legal frameworks, if you will? And neither of the two global compacts, the Global Compact for Refugees and the Global Compact for Migration, have looked into this particular category. So you have one Global Compact for migrants and one Global Compact for refugees, as if someone has to be either this or that. But in reality, and specifically in this region, there's a lot of mixed flaws. And so despite the acknowledgement of such pattern or trend, if you will, there has not been a consensus, neither on the definition nor on the legal framework. In response to this, recently at the center hosted a network of scholars looking particularly at the concept of mixed migration, whereby we unpacked the concept as a whole and also the impact. We have produced a variety of policy papers. I mean, one of them was looking at conceptualization of mixed migration in its sense. What do we really mean by it? And what is the legal contestations and implications for this term? We also looked at the impact of international cooperation on policies when it comes to mixed migration. The second implication, before I conclude my points for the time being, is also the ambivalent, and I think this was mentioned by my colleagues earlier, the ambivalence of the legal framework in the region in some countries. So you have regulations on entry and exit, but you don't have necessarily a legislation looking into refugees. Some countries have attempted to issue laws related to migration, or asylum, such as Morocco, its law on asylum, or Egypt combating irregular migration. However, again, the national legal protection remains very ambivalent, which has resulted, as some earlier scholars, of UNHCR becoming sort of an alternative state or a surrogate state. So like everyone is expecting also from the UN agency to provide services that might not be possible to be provided by a UN entity. These are my comments for the time being. Thank you.
What I was saying is that Egypt considers that Arab refugees should be dealt with in Egypt differently from other refugees, and argues that they actually provide more benefits. I agree with Maisa when you said that UNRWA is the one responsible for the Palestinians, but in essence the Egyptian position is, yes, but we give them the same benefits anyway, irrespective of whether they get it here. But my question, if I go back to Dr. Saad, let's take the Syrian case. Syrian case presently is the war is almost over physically, but the destruction isn't, nor is the refugee problem. One of the problems of supporting the return of refugees to Syria has been that the donor countries don't want to give money to the Syrian regime. Is there a legal framework that would allow UNHCR or some other agency to provide assistance to refugees returning to their home countries and consequently rebuilding their livelihood, either independent from the sovereign country or in cooperation with it? I don't know, I'm really asking. And if not, do we need one?
Thank you very much for this question. And until we speak, the assisted voluntary return framework by UNHCR has excluded return for Syrian refugees. So UNHCR engages in assisted voluntary return based on a criteria to ensure that the return is safe and that it will not jeopardize the situation. The challenge is basically, as Dr. Awad has mentioned, that also, if I understood it correctly, is that in recent years there has been a lot of funding channeled to Syrian refugees in host countries, but there has not been a perception on longer-term solutions as the one suggested. So as we speak, return does not happen through UNHCR to Syria. It does happen to other countries such as Iraq, Sudan, etc. But Syria has been excluded.
This is a very interesting question. You know, under international refugee law, you have three so-called durable solutions. Either local integration of refugees, which is rejected by countries in the region, or voluntary return, and the third is resettlement. Voluntary return has to be voluntary. Voluntary, let me put it this way. The refugees should themselves be willing to return. But it's not only about willing, it's about preparedness to return. They should be prepared to return, and the regions in their countries where they return should be prepared to receive them. So UNHCR has done surveys over the last few years, annual surveys. And the surveys show that Syrians, you ask Syrians, would you like to return? They say yes. Would you like to return next year? No. Like not more than 5% say that they will return next year. Most do not plan to return now at all. In Lebanon, in fact, there have been schemes to encourage Syrians to return. They have not returned. And you also have the attitudes, for instance, in Syria of the Syrian government. Is the Syrian government really willing to receive the refugees? So, for instance, young people who return should enlist in the army or pay $8,000 or something, so they don't return. Or you allow women and children only to return and not males, so they don't return. So you also have tricks by governments. But mostly, they should be ready to return, prepared to return, and they should return to functioning cities. Where will they return if there is no work, if there is no electricity, if there is no housing? So, in fact, it's not only a matter of you or I want to return, but whether the country that we return to is prepared to host us and to provide us with work, with employment, source of livelihoods or not. Are there schools for the children? Is there enough food for everyone, for the 24 million Syrians, including those who return? We have a large number of the internally displaced people. So the question is very tricky. And in fact, the panelist who should have been with us today tweeted, Jeff Crisp, tweeted 2 days ago. He said, return to a safe Syria. He did this, ironically, after the explosion in Damascus a couple of days ago. So is it really safe to return? So you want to return to a safe place. So the question is quite complex, and of course, it needs a very, very long discussion.
Well, I agree with you on all of that, but I mean, my point really is, if you achieve all of those points, which are the first steps, is there a capacity to provide assistance to the refugees per se, not necessarily to the host country? Or is there no way to do that?
I think
encourage them to return if all the other elements are filled in.
I think the real question here is whether the places you return to are ready to receive you or not. And this is something common to all refugee situations. It's not only to Syrian refugees or Iraqi refugees or other refugees. It's common to all refugees. Where do you return to? So yes, the assistance. In fact, refugees may not need assistance themselves, but if they know that if they return, they will have a house to live in, if there are schools for the children to go to, if they have employment to work in, they will return. So I don't think that the question is a question of assistance given to returnees themselves, but the question is the places and, of course, their preparedness themselves.
Okay, thank you, Bream. We have a few minutes for questions. Any questions, Dr. Dalal?
This is a unique center. It's amazing. I have a number of questions, if I may, and I'll address them to the panelists if anyone cares to address. I mean, first, and you touched on this, the shared identities and the initial sympathy very quickly gives way to the realities of life, limited resources, and the tension between the host communities and the refugee community. So do you have any thoughts, ideas on how to mitigate this particular issue? Because there is a major issue in many places, certainly in a place like Lebanon. The second question is, is there in international law, is there a formula that regulates the number of refugees that a certain country should take based on the capacity within that country, or is it open-ended, or is it a question of sovereignty or what have you? So is one country expected to host millions just because it borders a country which is suffering, and whereas other countries can decide not to host and so on. The third question, and you touched on that, the issue of politics versus economy, and the decisions that are driven by political decisions in a place like Lebanon. The pretext, I mean, by the way, Lebanon and Jordan both didn't sign, but there is a very different attitude towards refugees. In Jordan, Palestinian refugees can become ministers, and in Lebanon, they're not allowed, there are 70 professions that Palestinians are not allowed to engage in, and so on. So even there, it's not just a question of signing or not signing the international convention, it's also political. Now, the pretext in Lebanon, presumably, is that they don't want the Palestinians to become part of they want them to go back to their country. So they want them to maintain the refugee identity endlessly and so on, and therefore we deprive them from the right to work and so on. So this is a big question. The fourth question, I'll be quick, but forgive me, it's really intriguing. The fourth question is, and I think it's quite important, is the issue of refugees are agents in their own rights. Diasporic activism. They go to a country, they engage with the politics of the host country, they engage with the politics of their countries of origin in very complex ways. And by the way, across the spectrum. So there are, so again, any thoughts on this particular issue and how it unfolds and plays a role in the refugee status itself? And the last thing is sort of an observation. I don't know if you have any comment on that. Europe has been very unwelcoming to Arab refugees of all sorts. Now, I couldn't but marvel, actually, this is something I've been thinking about, not just in the context of this panel, how the attitude towards Afghani refugees is the exact opposite. There are Romania, which doesn't welcome any refugee from the Arab world, has quotas for refugees from Afghanistan, and they're welcoming them and so on. Mexico, countries which have never thought of welcoming refugees, Spain, Europe in general, and so on and so forth. Which of course is interesting. It's interesting how the international attitude towards refugees changes based on, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly what's shaping this differential attitude. But then there is a bigger question. When you observe this attitude towards welcoming, even encouraging refugees from Afghanistan to leave their country, is there a responsibility? I mean, does anyone have the right, let's get the judges, especially female judges and teachers out of Afghanistan, because they truly are in jeopardy, they are at risk. But does the international community have the right to empty Afghanistan of this particular segment of the population? Again, this is a kind of question. I mean, it's a dilemma. It's a dilemma between the humanitarian side of things, but also the long-term future of a country. Thank you. I mean, you don't need to answer all of these questions. I just, you really triggered a number of, questions in my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me first let the panel address any of the questions first, and then we'll see if we have time for a second round.
Would you like to address any questions?
I'll leave it to Dr. Brahim. I will just comment on the quota. I don't think there is. I mean, there is nothing in the convention that says that countries should take up to a certain number. And when it comes to quota, I mean, during 2015 in Europe, when there was this discussion about the quota system, that every country in Europe should take a number of refugees depending on the economic situation of the country and the number they already hosted, it was a big disagreement, and it ended up not being agreed upon. So that's the reality. But for the other questions, I leave it to Dr. Brahim.
Before I move to Brahim, I just want to add a question to what Dr. Dalal just asked. Is there a length of time after which the rights of refugees end in a particular country?
What do you mean?
Well, if a refugee coming to Egypt, we don't have refugee camps for a particular reason, and you know that as well as I do. But one of the problems we have always, one of the reasons why we didn't do that, we did not want to have the concentration so they don't become activists. But also, we did not want to give them a permanent residency. If we have, as is the case, for example, for Jordan, Palestinian refugees who have been there for 40 years, 50 years, 60 years, is there a point where Jordan is no longer obliged, if it was signed the treaty, no longer obliged to give the refugees the same rights because they've been, now they're resident, they're not, if you want, transient refugees? Brahim?
No. Let me address your question with the question of Dr. Dalal about number of refugees. You know, one of the real issues is that the 1951 Convention was negotiated with some 300,000 refugees in mind. Those who were remaining after World War II. So a very small number. The international system was very small. The 51 states that negotiated San Francisco and Venezuela had been probably 60 by 51. They had never imagined that states would become 193 and refugees would come from all over and they would be in the millions. In the 1980s, there were 3 million refugees from Ethiopia and Eritrea and Sudan. People forget, as if the Syrian refugee flows were the first of this magnitude. Countries of third world at the time, now they're called Global South, really bear the brunt of refugees. But there is no number, because nobody, in fact, thought. The problem of the 1951 Convention now is that what the negotiators had in mind is not valid for the moment. And there are calls to renegotiate, but thank God it is not renegotiated, because if it were renegotiated, it would be, in fact, the protections it provides would be reduced. So, in fact, the world was more generous in 1951 than it is today. So, in a few words, no, there is no limit to the number. Now, with the question of time, no, there is no time. As long as take Palestinian refugees to return, they have to return to a country that welcomes them. The Palestine problem is still there. So where will they go? They will go back to. The Afghan refugees have been around for 30 or 40 years. They are hosted in Pakistan. They are hosted in Iran, for instance. Take it's another complex issue. In northwest, the northwest of Africa. So no, there is no limit in time for the protection to be provided to refugees, as long as situation in their countries of origin. Now, of course, if countries, industrialized in particular, were generous enough to provide millions of resettlement opportunities, that would be great. The problem might be watered down, but this is not the case, and this is why countries of refuge, countries of first refuge, bear the brunt of the refugees.
Well, in essence, then, it's not really a pure application of the principle. Because in reality, refugees leaving a Middle Eastern country to its neighboring countries, staying there for 30 years, that recipient country will bear the burden of that increase in number. Does it get more assistance to support them, or is it has to cover the burden themselves?
Take, for instance, a Syrian refugee who goes to Germany, gets an asylum seeker, gets the status of refugee, works in Germany. After a few years, this refugee is entitled to apply to nationality and gets nationality. He's locally integrated.
That's in the German law.
No, everywhere. Now, in this region, countries are reserved with regard to local integration.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
So local integration is out of the question for countries in this region, and for many developing countries, by the way, not only for countries of this region. The question of politics of migration, of course, politics of migration, you mentioned Lebanon. Of course, Lebanon, each community has its own policy with regard to refugees in Lebanon because of the nature of the political system in Lebanon. But look at the reception given to Palestinian refugees from Syria, in Lebanon and in Jordan. So they were not very well received because, again, of the politics in Jordan, because they do not want to increase the weight of the Palestinian population in Jordan. So the political element will always come into play. Take Venezuela. How refugees from Venezuela are received by a country in which there is a right-wing government or a left-wing government. You will have different. Take Cuba and Haiti. A person coming from Haiti seeking refuge in the United States will be rejected. But one coming from Cuba will be accepted. So there will always be refugees is an issue that originates in politics. So politics will always be there to govern how reactions to refugees, the protection they are given.
But let me push you a little bit again. Can a country that has signatory to the treaties decide which refugee it accepts and which doesn't?
No, it will be a violation to its commitments under.
So in other words, by signing the agreement, it is depoliticizing its decision? I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just trying to...
And the question is that you sign and ratify an agreement and a convention and then you interpret it. So you have Australia, for instance, in order to not to violate its obligations under the 1951 convention, keeps refugees in an island country, in Nauru, and processes them there so that nobody says that it has violated the convention. See, so there are tricks. So countries in Central Europe, what countries in Central Europe do? So unfortunately, law does not apply. Maisa just mentioned that refugees have entitlements, even in law and in policy, but they do not have access to them. So there is always a gap between law, policy, and implementation. The Afghan refugees, you have lots of politics there, like the Vietnamese refugees. The Vietnamese refugees in the 1970s were to a great extent absorbed in the United States, even in South America. The Afghan refugees, there is always the politics here, and the United States was behind what happened in Afghanistan, and maybe the US has encouraged Romania to host them and welcome them. You need always to see how policy is made. It's not only declared policy, but policy making itself and what goes into it. I'm not aware, I don't frankly know, but I think that we should go behind and look at how policy is made with respect of Afghan refugees.
Thank you, Ibrahim. I've just been waved to that our time is up, so let me respect 5 minutes? Oh, okay. So we have 5 minutes. I wasn't sure what you were waving. Any other questions? Please, Nathan.
Thank you. I think this is a question primarily for Professor Sadek, but I'm not sure. So basically, this panel has talked an awful lot about how refugees are seen from an international legal perspective and practice and national legal systems. I'm wondering a little bit more about from refugees. The end of this discussion sort of got into it in terms of access. So they've got these legal statuses and so on, and specific kinds of ways in which they're seen and constructed by the states. To what extent do they have access to the legal systems to be able to take advantage of whatever rights they have?
Thank you very much for the question. And I mean, in reality, and also I'll answer this question in quickly, question by Dr. Dalal regarding the tensions as well. Because even on paper, if you have rights, most of refugees refrain from access to courts or access to justice because, again, of the ambivalence sometimes of implementation, and the fact of always the fear. Again, because there are different statuses as mentioned, whether you're an asylum seeker or refugee, or even worse, a closed file. In that case, you have no documents. So even if in reality or on paper, just say on paper, you have access to certain rights, because there is no national legislation speaking regionally, these policies often change. So you have decrees every 1 year or 2 years. Of course, there's a sort of preferential treatments for Arab refugees, as mentioned, but some refugees, even if they have access, they refrain from having it. Still, there is a lot of stigma around medical access. They worry that if they go there, their kidneys would be extorted. I mean, even if these are all rumors. Again, with the education, they worry about racism, etc. So again, there's also an element of local integration, and I'll just tackle this very quickly about your question. And I think, again, quoting Jeff Crisp, without engaging the local community, there will always be resentment towards refugees, particularly when it comes to injection of funds, or this is the perception of local communities. And recently, and reflecting on some projects I've worked with that have entailed communication with members of the states. And they mentioned that you can have a project, but you, rather than call it local integration, you call it social cohesion. I mean, there are always sensitivities around having a quota for locals, which I think is a good step. So if we talk about children on the move, you should have Egyptian children on the move, for instance, or Lebanese children, or whatever the context is. Similarly, also with using the language. So again, social cohesion is allowed, so by having new projects, livelihood projects, and this is actually starting, I mean, at least from the perception of Egypt. Recently, lots of NGOs who initially used to work, and UN agencies initially working with Egyptians, are now working with Egyptians and migrants. And by having projects that involve both of them, for instance. But again, there's still also a little bit of sensitivity, as mentioned, around local integration and cohesion, because countries want to have what's in it for the countries there. So if you are increasing the integration of refugees, then the countries need to have some sort of benefit of hosting the refugees for a long term. Also, tackling quickly the question by Dean Fahmy, countries, of course, are not allowed to, as Dr. Ibrahim mentioned, to reject, but in some cases, and I've seen this in one particular country, whereby the state asked UNHCR not to register refugees from a certain area. So again, and it was a country in the Middle East that hosted Syrians, but then on the other hand thought that it is not interested to host African refugees. And for some reason, some cases of return that looks like voluntary return, but ended up in being sort of forced return has happened. So countries, as Dr. Ray mentioned, can also go about the system whether they are signatories or not. I hope I answered your question. Please.
I want to add something to this in reply to your question. In fact, Turkey is a party to the 1951 Convention, but it excludes all asylum seekers coming from other than from Europe from the application. So the scope of the convention is only the scope of the 1951 Convention. Did not adhere to the 1967 protocol, which means that refugees coming from Syria or from Iraq will never be considered refugees, and they cannot apply for a refugee status there. So yes, you're right. You can exclude because the original the 51 Convention, it is a person seeking discrimination because of events happening in Europe before the 1st of January 1951. So in this case, of course, those coming from Middle East will not be considered entitled to seek asylum.
Well, I do think we finished our time. Let me thank the three panelists.